Welcome back to another episode of Palisade Radio. This is your host, Colin Cattell. Very pleased to have Doug Casey back with us on the program today. Doug Casey, of course, is an author, New York Times best-selling author. He's an investor, he's a speculator, and happy to call him a neighbor down at La Estancia de Cafayate. Doug, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Colin. It's good to be back here with you. I'm in Aspen. You are outside of Toronto, but you're generally in Puerto Rico these days, right?
That is correct. Yep, I'm taking advantage of living in Puerto Rico on an island and all the other advantages that come along with that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Of course, I'm only here in Aspen during the northern summer, and the rest of the time I'm in Argentina and Uruguay.
Both beautiful places and probably very good places to incubate ideas for writing books. You just had your second book come out, which you've co-authored with John Hunt. This one's called Drug Lord. And for anybody interested in your first book, we had a great discussion about it called Speculator, which we did the interview last year. Doug, I want to talk to you about Drug Lord in quite detail, but before we jump into that, I wanted to get your opinion as a prolific speculator on where you see the commodities at this point in time.
Well, it's always been an area of specialization of mine. I've been involved in the commodities markets for way too long, 40 years at this point. My feeling is this, starting with the 40,000-foot view, the longest bear market in all of history is commodities. They've been going down in real terms for the last 10,000 years, literally, since the end of the last age. And they'll continue going down. However, the important thing is what they do cyclically. And the last peak in commodities was in about 2011 for most commodities. Since then, almost all of them, grains, softs, metals, have come down about 50%. And of course, since 2011, the dollar itself has probably lost about 20% in value. So commodities right now are quite cheap, and most producers are either losing money or just breaking even. So I'm friendly towards commodities right now in general, but friendly towards gold and silver in particular. And yes, I hate to say it, I'm actually getting friendly towards copper as well. So it's time to look at these things.
Doug, I think it would be fair to say that you've done quite well over the past couple decades speculating in the smallest portion or smallest area of the commodity space, which is the juniors and junior exploration companies. And of course, it's well known that because of the leverage afforded by those companies, the gains can be truly astronomical in a bull market. Do you expect a similar run that we maybe saw from 2000 to 2007, or in the 90s, where a lot of these companies went up by 20, 50, 100-fold?
Yeah, because I first started playing with these things in the 70s. And typically in those days, Canadian companies, Australian companies have always had hundreds of millions or billions of shares out there. And I haven't done much with Australian companies because they're on the other side of the world. It's hard to get to know their managements. So I stick to the Canadian and U.S. traded companies. And the markets are not as volatile as they were back in those days. But to answer the question, yes, these junior mining stocks are quite low right now from many points of view, and I'm buying them. And the way I would usually prefer to do it is in the form of private placements, which you're very familiar with, because you can usually get them at a discount to the market, and very importantly, get a warrant attached that allows you to buy an extra share at a fixed price for 2 years, 3 years, sometimes even 5 years. So, yeah, absolutely. This is an excellent time to be getting back into these things.
I don't have the benefit of having experienced cycles of the past. I remember sitting with you, Doug, in Argentina 2 or 3 years ago, certainly before this bull market kicked into gear in January, and I was in the bottom of that bear market thinking, when will this ever turn around, and forgetting what the gains looked like from an earlier cycle. And you had thought back to the 70s and 80s and just had mentioned how much these stocks would move day after day after day. And can you just recall that a bit for our listeners, how insane the movements can get?
Oh, it's incredible. When a bear market strikes these junior resource stocks, they will drop 90%, 85%. The worst bear market ever for them. I'm trying to. There have probably been about 6 or 7 major bear markets since gold broke free from $35 an ounce in 1971. There have been 6 or 7 bull markets followed by bear markets in each case. And the worst of them, the market as a whole, fell about 97%. And a lot of stocks just disappeared. Where are we now? Well, look, in the last bear market that started, let's look at recent bull markets and bear markets. The last major bottom was in about 2002, and then it ran up to 2007. I wish I had a chart in front of me. It would make more sense if I was looking at the chart right now, but we're still very close to the bottom. It's been coming off the bottom for about a year, quite frankly. So now is the time you look to get into good issues. I mean, that's the bottom line as far as I'm concerned. And how high can they go? Look, when the market gets a bit in its teeth, people say, "Oh, fantastic bull market if the Dow Jones doubles." Absolutely, but these stocks are the most volatile stocks on the planet, and it's not unusual to see the market as a whole go up 1,000%, 10-1, with individual issues going up 50-1 or even more. Now, when the bear market strikes, a lot of them will dry up, blow away, disappear, and if they go up 10-1, they'll drop 95%. They'll drop even further than they went up. So it's a very, very volatile market, and people don't like volatility. But if you have the right perspective, volatility is your friend, not your enemy. So I'm looking for it to be my friend in the coming bull market, which we're in the early stages of now, I think.
Excellent. Well, Doug, speaking of volatility, and we spoke briefly about this before we started recording, Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and I'll preface the discussion the same way I did when we first got on the call. I can imagine that philosophically you really like the idea of cryptocurrencies as an anarchist, probably bothered slightly by the price action that we've seen and the parabolic charts on some of these things.
That's exactly correct, Colin. That's exactly the way I feel about it. I'm very, very pro all forms of technology because technology itself has liberated the average man since day one. I mean, gunpowder gave the average guy the opportunity to take an armored knight off a horse for the first time. The printing press gave the average guy the keys to the kingdom of knowledge, which only the priests and the upper classes had. And this is true of the internet, and now it's true of blockchain technology, of which the cryptocurrencies are just the first application. So I'm very, very philosophically friendly towards them. But I've got to say, I first was introduced to, Bitcoin. There are many other cryptocurrencies now. But I was introduced to Bitcoin, 3 or 4 years ago, when I was in Kapajat, and a young Belgian guy named Tour de Meester was visiting, and I bought him lunch. So he gave me a Bitcoin, a physical Bitcoin. They exist, which you can put on the internet by transcribing the codes. But I still have that. And at the time it was $13. And I listened to his presentation about why I ought to buy a bunch of them. And idiotically, I didn't. $13, now it's $5,000 or thereabouts. So what am I doing about them now? Starting about 2 or 3 months ago, I put about $100,000 into various cryptocurrencies, mostly in Bitcoin, because just because the market's bubbly doesn't mean that it's not going higher. And my understanding is that only about 25 million people in the world currently actually own Bitcoin. Now, there's 7.5 billion almost people in the world, so it's got a long way to go. And Bitcoin has so many advantages, especially for people in the third world. If you're going to save a currency, well, they like dollars when they can, but that's not always possible. But they all have cell phones. And rather than owning kwachas and pulas and Zimbabwe dollars, which don't exist anymore, incidentally, people will be buying Bitcoin. More and more, millions of people more will be buying them, and it's going to put upward pressure on it. So it may be in the $4,000 to $5,000 range now, but I can see it going higher. I spent a day with John McAfee at his house about a couple of weeks ago. He thinks it's going to $50,000. I don't know, but I think it's possible, and he's one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about these things.
Doug, one could argue at this point, and I think your $100,000 investment suggests that you might agree. The price of Bitcoin at $13, it was so far from adoption that, of course, in hindsight, you would love to get in then. But now with it at $4,000 or $5,000 and such a small percentage of the worldwide or the world using it, that now is almost a safer time to be buying it, and there is still that tremendous amount of upside. And, if you think the technology is real and it's here to stay, it certainly has to go higher.
Yeah, I think so. What are the alternatives for the average guy, especially in a third world country? They don't want to use these completely ridiculous currencies that they have throughout Africa, South America, and so forth. They all have smartphones now. So, yeah, they're going to buy Bitcoin and Bitcoin lookalikes because, among other things, if you own a Zambian kwacha, it's only good in Zambia. And really not much good there, quite frankly. So they're all going to Bitcoin, and they can transfer the things around the world quickly with no cost. One of the nice things about Bitcoin and why it should go higher is it's going to put a bullet in the head of the SWIFT system, which is slow and costly, and hopefully it'll destroy the current banking system, which is unstable in addition. So, I hate to buy anything that's gone up as much as the cryptocurrencies, but it's the wave of the future. And blockchain technology, of which the cryptos are just the first application, may be the biggest thing since the internet itself. So lots of reason to be bullish.
Doug, one last question before we switch over to your second book. Cryptos, do you think that they are a threat in any way to the precious metals like gold and silver? Is it going to take significant capital away from our potential earnings in those commodities rising?
No, I don't. I think they're a complement, because one thing that Bitcoin has done is it's introduced people to, it's gotten them thinking about the concept of currencies. And they see that they've been using the dollar or the euro or the whatever for a currency. And then they've asked themselves, well, what's the value of Bitcoin or Ethereum and these various other currencies? And the objections brought up, the Bitcoin isn't backed by anything. Right. And then they naturally come to the conclusion, wait a minute, my dollars aren't backed by anything either. But the U.S. government is printing up unlimited numbers of dollars, and the number of bitcoins are limited. And the bitcoin is, which the dollar in the banking system is not. So in other words, Bitcoin has many, many advantages over the dollar. It's making people question the dollar. Now, why is that good for gold? Because if people question the dollar, they're going to see that gold is much better than the dollar, and it's actually better than Bitcoin, although it lacks some advantages of Bitcoin, but it has other advantages. So it's going to get people, the Bitcoin revolution is getting people thinking about the idea of currency and understanding the problems with the fiat currencies of governments, and it's going to flow into gold and help them. It's going to help people understand why gold is money. So it's a good thing. They go together, Bitcoin and gold.
I think you're the first person I've heard draw that comparison and make the case, and I think that's pretty profound and actually quite exciting for gold. A lot of infighting has been happening between the hard money gold silver crowd and the Bitcoin crowd, and I tend to agree with you that they're a perfect complement. And from a political standpoint, both of them have great qualities that undermine the existing power structures, and it's going to be great to see how this all plays out in the next few years.
Yes, absolutely. And it's going to play out during a time of financial and economic chaos, because I think we're leaving the eye of the huge hurricane that we entered in 2007. And it's going to be very, very ugly, I think, in the next few years. Much different, much worse, and much longer lasting than what we experienced in 2008 and 2009.
Absolutely. Well, Doug, let's talk about your book. I read your first and your second book, and in your first book, without giving away too many details, your protagonist, Charles Knight, is speculating in Africa. There's many similarities that I saw that you must have taken from the Briac scandal back in the 90s, which of course you had profited quite nicely on. And you wrote a book around this and really pointed out the inadequacies of the government and the benefits that a speculator has to the economy. And in the second book, you've shifted over to a different profession for your same protagonist, where he is a drug lord. The title would suggest something quite sinister, but in fact, upon reading it, somehow you've made your protagonist out to be quite a good person he comes across. So starting out, Doug, what were you trying to do with this second book as opposed to the first one?
Well, what I'm trying to do in this series, Colin, and there are going to be 7 books in the series, what I'm trying to do is reform the unjustly besmirched reputations of some very politically incorrect occupations. And everybody's supposed to hate speculators, and I'm explain that trade and show a speculator as a good guy, contrary to the reputation. And now I'm showing that a drug lord, whether he's dealing in legal or illegal drugs, and Charles does mostly the latter, can also be a very good guy. And I explain the drug trade and how it works and so forth. And see, there are a lot of things you can say in fiction that you really shouldn't say, or you got to be careful about saying in nonfiction, especially in today's world. So that's why I took novels as the vehicle for explaining these things. And also, it's a different market. It's a different group of people, to some degree, that read fiction as opposed to nonfiction. So that's really doing this. And the next book, which is going to come out next year, Charles, who's kind of pissed off because when he's a speculator and when he's a drug lord, he makes a huge amount of money, and in both cases, the government steals it from him. So he's kind of pissed off, and that's why he becomes an assassin. which I'll explain that trade and the history of assassins throughout the world, and the most importantly, the morality of assassins and assassinations. But so you might say that the drug lord is kind of a gateway drug to really heavy stuff, which is going to be coming in the novels that will be released next year and the year after and so forth.
Doug, there are a couple reasons that I enjoy these novels so much. One of them is they're a refreshing change from just about all of the other content that is out there. I'm sure there must be something in the fiction world that tries to convey similar ideas to what you are, but certainly not on my radar. But what I really enjoy is you have a incredible knack as a novelist for taking all these ideas and tying them together. Even I noticed from the first book into the second book that there was a lot of forward thinking you must have done to make sure everything kind of ties together. And there's themes of investing and speculating, of course, even in the second book. And I don't want to give any of the content of the book away, but just a fantastic job on putting it all together and making it work so well.
Well, thanks, Colin. And, you know, when Charles Knight, at age 23, at the end of Speculator, he travels around the world for 7 years before he becomes drug lord. And in the future, we're going to have a few flashbacks about what he did traveling around the world during those 7 years. And thanks for your comment about the nature of these books, because, you know, I've read a number of popular fiction books, like read several of the Jack Reacher novels, which they're also making into films. And the problem with most of these so-called page turners with heroes is that they don't have any intellectual content. I mean, they're fun to read, and the adventures are great. I enjoy that, like the Jack Reacher books. But typical of the genre, there's not a lot of intellectual content. You don't really learn anything. And what I'm trying to do, what John Hunt and I are trying to do, is give people a practical education in a lot of fields while they're being entertained. And that's one of the ways that I like to think that the Charles Knight novels are different.
Certainly, and digressing a bit from the discussion on the novels, I couldn't help but, in seeing this whole Bitcoin mania that has sprouted up, thinking of the absolute necessity of a speculator. The people who were buying these Bitcoins at $5, $10, $15 were visionaries, but also crazy in a sense that they were putting a good bit of their net worth into something that had such little chance of making it at the time. I mean, such a small adoption rate. And when people ask me if I'm invested at this point, I've said, you know, I am not willing to speculate my money on this at the point it's at, but I'm so happy that other people are.
Yes. Incidentally, here in Aspen, there's a conference called the Nexus Conference taking place from September 20 to 23, where they've got all kinds of leading lights in the blockchain, Bitcoin area. And I was pleasantly surprised that they asked me to give a couple speeches to this conference here in Aspen. And I'm looking forward to meeting some of the, some of the gurus in the blockchain world. Like, for instance, Roger Ver, who they call Bitcoin Jesus, is going to be here. And I'm looking forward to talking to him and learning more about this area. Highly technological computer jock myself. But actually, the next thing in technology, it's not going to even be computers. I mean, that was 60s stuff when Jobs and Gates and, the other guys that founded billion-dollar corporations from their garages. The next thing is going to be biotech stuff, CRISPRs. And I'm really looking to find the right couple of guys that are doing genetic modifications in their garage the way Steve Jobs did back in the 60s and 70s. That's the next thing, not computers. It's going to be biological. So the world is really changing more rapidly than ever. Technology has been an exponential trend, believe it or not, since the Paleolithic era. But now things are happening hyperbolically, exponentially faster. And I think the whole character of life is going to change in 20 years.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the technology that's coming into play with the blockchain and just how it completely decentralizes the potential power structure. And I'm sure you sit back and try to do some thinking about what the world could look like, but it's got to be truly hard to imagine when we're stuck in the mind frame of government control as we are right now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, people act like such sheep. Sorry that Jay Leno was off the air, because I used to love watching his jaywalking skits, which you can Google. But it just shows you how unknowledgeable the average guy is. Well, it's understandable. The average guy, quite understandably and intelligently, actually, is just looking at his own life in his own little part of the world. But, it's funny when jaywalking, Jay would ask somebody, so who won the Civil War? And the person would look at him and say, the Germans. The average guy just doesn't know much besides what the Kardashians are doing and sports and what's going on in his own life, which is pretty dangerous because the average guy votes, and that leads to all kinds of political problems, which are really dangerous.
Yes, amazing. Doug, if you have to jump, do let me know at any time. I just wanted to ask you about Donald Trump. You were one of the few people who maybe wanted Trump to win and actually believed that he could, and you told us that on Palisade Radio. You said, I think Donald Trump is going to win, and of course he did. Disappointed in his ability to do anything, or what's your feeling at this point?
Well, yeah, you're right, Colin. And I bet Marin Katusa 100 ounces of silver that the Donald would win. And yeah, I wanted to see him win because it would have been a total disaster if Hillary had won. At least Donald wasn't at that time part of the deep state, but he's being co-opted into it. So yeah, I'm pretty disappointed by him. He's not getting out of Afghanistan or Iraq, and God knows he might start a war with North Korea or Iran or whatever in addition. So that's very disappointing. And a lot of the people he has around him they're generals, and I generally hate generals, or ex-Goldman people, so that hasn't changed too much. He's doing some good things. He's trying to fire a bunch of people in these agencies, but then again, you remember the IRS scandal a couple of years ago where they fired like 200 IRS people? Well, they've been hired back. So I'm afraid nothing is going to change. And the problem, one of the big problems with Trump, well, lots of problems, is that he's somehow equated or overly associated with the free market. But he's not a free market guy. He's not a libertarian. He's an authoritarian. And when the economy collapses, it's going to be another excuse to blame those wrong on the free market. So I'll make a prediction now. See if you put this someplace where you won't forget it. I think in 2020, assuming we have national elections, anything could happen actually, I think the winner, I don't know if he's going to be a Republican or a Democrat, there's not much difference between the two parties anymore, believe it or not, although the Democrats are worse. I think we're going to a left-wing general for the next president of the U.S. And I say that because the only thing that people trust is the military, and Trump is going to be called right-wing, so it's going to be somebody who is much traditionally left-wing. So that's my prediction for the elections of 2020.
Well, that's an interesting prediction, Doug. One thing that we didn't talk about earlier in the interview is the continuing rise in pretty much every asset price out there, which excluded commodities up until last year. They've now started to rise a bit. Do you think that this asset price ascension, including the Dow Jones, of course, is going to continue for a while longer?
I do. I hate to say that because, the stock market in general is overpriced. But here's why I believe that's true. Because these governments are going to keep printing up trillions and trillions of new currency units. Now, where are those currency units going to go? Well, a lot of them are going to start going into the things you buy day to day, food, shelter, clothing, this type of thing, much more. So we're going to see retail price inflation. But most of them are going to go into the financial markets, and they're going to create new bubbles. So this augurs well for the stock market and for the Bitcoin market and for the gold market and for the mining stock market, because these governments, in panic, these central banks trying to hold everything together, are going to keep doing the only thing they can do, which is create more money. So, yeah, I think it's going to go higher. The only thing I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole are bonds. They're a super bubble, a hyper bubble. That's an accident waiting to happen. And the stock market is going to crash. I don't know when, but I think it could go higher. I'm not involved in it, except for these mining stocks. But, yeah, it could go higher. And that's the argument for Bitcoin going higher as well. And at some point, these trillions, the major export of the U.S. is dollars. It's not wheat or computers. It's dollars. We export dollars. Who send us Mercedes and Sonys and cocaine and stuff. And at some point, these foreigners, trillions and trillions of dollars, are going to say, "Wait a minute, I don't want to hold this on-back liability of the bankrupt U.S. government," and they're going to start offloading them, and they're going to come back to the U.S., and it's going to be a catastrophe. So, that's in the cards also.
Excellent. Well, absolute last question here to talk on a bit of mutually beneficial promotion never hurt anyone, and I'm sure some listeners would love to hear about a stock that you're heavily invested in the resource space, which one of them you've talked about before on the show, Metalla, royalty and streaming. It's an earlier stage royalty company, and E.B. Tucker, who's the head of Casey Research, is a director. Brett Heath is a great guy, the CEO, and I know you've mentioned it on multiple occasions. Anything to say on that point?
I own a bunch of Metalla. I've been buying it for the last year. It's at a new high, about 61, 62 cents as we speak, Canadian. I think within the year it's going to double. It's going to at least double. It's not even listed on the VSE yet. And just when it's listed on the regular VSE, it's on the CSA now, which is like a baby Canadian exchange. Once it goes on the VSE and institutions can buy it, that alone should take it close to $1. So, first of all, listen, you know as well as I do that people shouldn't buy a stock on a tout. They got to look into these things. But I'll tell them to look into Metalla. And I'm just talking my book. I own a bunch. I'm not selling. And it's going to be paying a dividend, believe it or not. They're anticipating a penny a share, believe it or not, on a 60-cent stock, starting within the next 4 or 5 months. So penny a share a month is what they're hoping. We'll see if they can do it. No, the stock's going higher. So that's my stock tout. And can I mention my website in addition?
Absolutely.
So if people would like to take a look at our free publications, we have a lot of free publications. They're very high quality, very good. go to caseyresearch.com, and also, it's different, internationalman.com, another daily free blog, which is really fantastic. And go to High Ground Books if you don't go to Amazon to get Drug Lord and Speculator. So that's my commercial.
Great. Well, you did my work for me. I was going to say we will include the link at the bottom of our YouTube description to the Amazon link for Drug Lord, which is the second book in the High Ground series by Doug Casey. Doug, thank you so much for coming on the program and spending a good chunk of your day with us to talk about the book and many other things.
Well, it's a pleasure, Colin, and we will do this in the new year and see how things have evolved.
Think you understand the junior mining sector, and you think that the participants in the mining sector, junior mining sector, are good people and kind people, hit the bid.
How violent that term could be, it actually could be quite violent. It could be a rip-your-face-off uranium rally.
And the world is always going to need raw materials. It's going to need copper and gold and nickel and so forth.
Totally destabilized. Hey, Troll, did you hear what's going on in Yemen?